Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, February 29th, 2024. Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us now. There's nothing to laugh at, but one of the viewers, Colonel, just wrote in and said, I'd like to hear Colonel Macgregor conduct one of these interviews in a Scottish brogue.
He's asking the wrong man. I couldn't. By the way, brogue is Irish. When you say Scottish, they mean burr.
Oh, burr. Okay. Actually, he didn't say brogue. He said Scottish accent. I incorrectly called it a brogue, but thank you for the correction. There's very little to laugh at, so the humor is out of the way, and I need to speak to you about Israel and Gaza and also Ukraine. I want to start with Ukraine. I want your comments on the French president, and I won't characterize them. I'll let you watch what he said, and then you can tell me if you think this is crazy or profound. President Emmanuel Macron 2 days ago.
There is no consensus today to send ground troops in an official, endorsed and sanctioned manner, but in dynamic terms, nothing should be ruled out.
I think there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, is the essence of it crazy that nothing should be ruled out? And secondly, is he suggesting that French troops may be there in an unofficial capacity?
I think the man is certifiable. Let's get that straight. He's talking about effectively declaring war on Russia, and that's what people don't seem to understand. You send conventional military formations into Western Ukraine, you're going to end up at war with Russia. And I think President Putin has made that clear repeatedly. He's not going to tolerate any external intervention. And while he certainly doesn't want a war with NATO, he's made it clear that if any NATO members send their forces, organized forces into Eastern or Western Ukraine with the intention of fighting Russians, they would be at war. You know, one of the things that needs to be kept in mind, there is always the outside possibility that Macron made this public statement so that everybody else in the NATO alliance could immediately distance themselves from him, which is exactly what's happened. Virtually everyone has said, out of the question, we won't do it. Even the United States, in a fit of reasonableness, decided to say it's out of the question. So perhaps that was the reason it was done, but otherwise it makes no sense.
Here's one of those responses, the Chancellor of Germany.
NATO is not and will not be party to the war. That remains the case. We do not want Russia's war against Ukraine to become a war between Russia and NATO. We agree on this with all our allies. This also means no German participation in the war. To put it bluntly, as German Chancellor, I will not be sending any members of the German armed forces to Ukraine. Our soldiers can count on that, and you too can count on that.
Colonel, do you know if there are French or German special forces there, perhaps out of uniform, perhaps called contractors or mercenaries, but they are truly military personnel of Germany and France?
I do not. I can't confirm or deny it. I know that British and American special ops forces in small numbers have been on Ukrainian soil. There's no question about it. And some of the attacks that you've seen with drones at sea and some of the missile strikes, they have undoubtedly been assisted enormously by the British SAS. I'm told SAS elements or British special ops elements also play a role in Mr. Zelensky's security. But as far as anything else, no, I cannot confirm it. I wouldn't exclude the possibility that there are others on the ground there trying to help or assist in some way, but I haven't seen it.
New York Times had a lengthy piece. I'm sure you saw it. It was somewhat weird. It appears to have been leaked by the CIA because there's a lot of patting on the back of the CIA, claiming that the CIA has 12 bases. I didn't know they called them bases when the CIA builds them. I thought those were what the military built, but whatever. I want to get into a thing about terminology. In Ukraine, I'm sure the Russians know exactly where they are and what's going on there. But my point is, how much help is the CIA providing to Ukrainian intel and Ukrainian soldiers can an argument be made if American special ops out of uniform or in uniform are helping Ukrainian military personnel use American equipment, if that military equipment is being used to send projectiles into Russia, if the projectiles came from the United States of America, Colonel, is the United States starting a war against Russia?
Well, strictly speaking, I think you can argue that we have been a co-belligerent along with many of us, our allies, on the basis of what you just described. I mean, that's an easy argument to make. But bear in mind that President Putin, contrary to popular belief in the West, has never wanted a war with the United States or its allies in Europe. Never. Has never had any aspirations to move west to attack anybody. Doesn't now. I think it's important to understand that there are a couple of realities that have dawned on the people in the West. Number one is you can tinker on the margins of this war and pretend that you're having a profound impact. And that's what we've done. But you're not going to fundamentally influence it. Secondly, if you actually provoke the Russians to the point where they feel compelled to fight back, and I'm talking about the introduction of conventional military power, we have no integrated air defenses in the eastern border of Western Europe. In other words, between us and the Russians, there is almost no air defense, air and missile defense capability. That means that in the event that there were a conflict or confrontation and we attacked them with air power, which is what a British admiral recently said we might do, we would lose badly because tens of thousands of missiles that we could not stop would rush through and attack every conceivable airfield, port, or installation of any military significance in Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, France, Italy, and the rest of Europe. There's nothing they can't reach. I don't think that comes up for discussion very much. And then we have this assumption that our air power, on which we've depended almost exclusively since the end of the Second World War for any kind of strategic impact and long-range attack, is probably not going to survive contact with all of the Russian air defenses. Right now, we see new air defenses springing up in Syria, northern Lebanon, Iran. I think we're going to see more of it in parts of Iraq. And I think it's going to challenge our air supremacy. It hasn't been there before in any great numbers. It's going to start showing up. We are accustomed to no enemy in the air. Well, the enemy is a missile, and it comes in the form of air defense and anti-missiles. And that's going to change everything. So I think everybody is sobered up and concluded what Schultz said. The other thing is Schultz and most of his colleagues are on very thin ice. They're close to being voted out of office. And he's trying to say, please, 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 I'm not going to send you to war. Relax. And the Germans will not tolerate a war against Russia. They didn't sign up for it. They don't want it.
Here's what President Putin said. This is just a 27-second clip as part of one of his longish speeches in response to President Macron and in response to some other nonsense that came out of Poland. You and I emailed about it. I'm going to ask you about Poland in a minute, and also what the Prime Minister of Great Britain said a week and a half ago that caused his predecessor, who's now the secretary or the foreign minister, to try and pull back from it. But here's cut number 12, Chris. Here's President Putin threatening war over this.
They should eventually understand that we also have weapons, and they know it. I just said it now myself. Weapons that can hit targets on their territory. Everything that the West is coming up with now, what they threaten the world with, it can result in a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization.
You surprised he used language that strong, Colonel?
No, not at all. I think he felt it was absolutely necessary to make it unambiguously clear that if you attack Russian territory, we reserve the right to respond with whatever we think is appropriate, up to and including nuclear weapons. That's why you possess nuclear weapons in this age. It's really almost exclusively for territorial integrity and protection. And I think he wanted to put to rest, if there was any question in anybody's mind, what happens if you attack Russia, this is the answer. So I think it's a very good way to put the whole issue to bed, and I think that helped to convince Schultz and everybody else to forget it.
How dangerous is the leadership of Poland and their inclinations toward a war with Russia?
You mean the incredibly stupid comment by Andrzej Duda saying
Yes, I do. You and I emailed about that with a Polish friend of ours.
yeah,
Tell us about it.
the world would be better off if no Russia existed? The only thing one can conclude from this sort of thing is immense stupidity, and that's putting it mildly. Anyone who is Polish has more sense than that. I don't know where he's from. He must be from another country. Most of the Poles I know are more sensible than that. It's absurd. It's stupid. We should ignore it. Unfortunately, we cheer it on because we're led by a small minority of people that are very well financed that are determined to do whatever they can to harm Russia. But it's not going to happen. By the way, to get back to your 12 CIA bases, that's very interesting because normally when something like that is deliberately leaked to an outlet like the New York Times, which has contributed to the fiction that Ukraine could win and Russia was going to be defeated, it indicates that we're close to the end. That at some point in the near future, we're simply going to quietly leave. You know, that's what we do. When we create disasters, there's no other way to do it. We just pack our things, get onto the boats, get into the air, and we go home. I think that's coming. And I think that's what the real meaning is, because otherwise they would never have told us that.
Chris, play cut number 9. Here's the Deputy Secretary of State who has blood on her hands because of all she's been doing over there for so long. But I'm going to ask you, after listening to her at her bombastic worst, if she knows that the end is coming. Please listen, Colonel, for the last 5 or 6 words she uses, claiming inexplicably, crazily, that our involvement in Ukraine has made the United States safer.
Without sending a single U.S. soldier into combat and investing less than 1/10 of 1 year's defense budget of the United States, we have helped Ukraine destroy 50% of Russia's ground combat power, 50%, and 20% of its vaunted Black Sea fleet. Ukraine has taken off the battlefield 21 naval ships, 102 Russian aircraft, and 2,700 Russian tanks. By every measure, Ukraine's bravery and strength, its resilience, has made the United States safer too.
Does this woman know that she's lying?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. And she has no reservations whatsoever about doing so. Remember, this is an ideologue. This is a globalist, neocon, whatever you want to call it, revolutionary, who is determined that she's going to destroy her enemies. Now, you know, Russia is not the enemy of the American people, but she thinks it's her enemy and her friends' enemies. And Ukraine is utterly and completely destroyed. You know, you've got over a million casualties and 1/2 million dead, 500,000 at least. I'm told it's now up to about 530,000 dead. The entire Ukrainian population that is still under, Zelensky's control lives in mortal fear of Zelensky and his regime. That's what people don't seem to understand in this country. They're afraid to speak up and express any opinion at all. Nobody wants to fight anymore. And people certainly don't want to be utterly annihilated by the Russians. So they're dealing with a secret police that can show up at any time, arrest people, imprison people, shoot people. The NKVD is really the model for Zelensky and his friends. And that's what's going on in Ukraine right now. So no, Ukraine is destroyed as a nation. She could care less. And the interesting part is, and I don't know about her numbers, she may have some of that correct, especially in the Black Sea Fleet. But Russia is not a maritime power. And frankly, surface vessels to them are irrelevant. Everything hinges on submarines. Secondly, Russia today as a military power is stronger and greater than it's been since the early 80s. And it might well grow stronger. The Russian General Staff has been told to look into the potential for the mobilization of 800,000 additional troops. Now, I hope that doesn't become necessary, because the only circumstances under which I can conceive of that being useful is if they are compelled to cross the Dnieper River and go west. And that happens only if no one will sit down and negotiate with Moscow. And if you listen to the Tucker interview with President Putin, he repeatedly said, that he was open to negotiations and looking for a way to end the conflict, not because the Russians are losing, that's absurd, but because he knows how destructive and pointless the war is, and he has no wish to continue it.
I was moved by a statement by the retirement German general and former chair of the NATO Military Committee, saying that Putin has no intention whatsoever to conquer Ukraine, notwithstanding what Mrs. Newland, what the President Biden, what Tony Blinken have said. And it made me wonder, do your colleagues, retired senior military people in Western Europe, have this general sober view that you do, or do they have the maniacal view of the American neocons?
I would tell you that many do share what you call a maniacal view for the same reasons that you have many retired 4-stars and senior officers in the U.S. Armed Forces express similar views, because they're on the payroll. They're paid handsomely by forces, by entities, institutions, in the media, in their governments, that are ultimately beholden to this ideological coterie of the ruling class. These are what I call Western oligarchs, billionaires who are essentially buying political support and buying up retired officers and paying them to say what they say. You're not going to hear anybody like Petraeus or Keane or the rest of these people stand up and suddenly start telling the truth. That's not what they're being paid to do.
So this
retired A1 say, Russia is going to lose.
This retired general, 4-star, whose words motivated me, he's an outlier.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah.
Wow. Well, you agree with him, obviously. I mean, look at what President Putin said to Tucker Carlson, and look at everything else he said. There's no indication whatsoever that he wants to, I'll use Joe Biden's phrase, take Ukraine.
Well, remember, the idea behind this entire proxy war was that Russia is weak. It can't withstand us. We can disrupt it, and we can ultimately pull down the Putin regime because the population doesn't support him. These were the fundamental assumptions, all of which were false. They can't back away from those assumptions. And unfortunately, we're stuck with the outcome, which, as you see, is the very opposite of everything they said. Anybody with any sense who looked at it objectively would have reached the same conclusion. But these people that we're discussing, I don't know what the right phrase is to describe them, this ruling class that dominates Western Europe and the United States, is very similar. They're all ideologically committed to something that, however false, however wrong, must be upheld and maintained to the bitter end.
Switching over to Israel and Gaza. Earlier today, hundreds of Gazans were online to receive flour and water from an aid truck, and more than 100 were mowed down by the IDF. Another example, in my view, of the barbarity with which Prime Minister Netanyahu and his folks have conducted this horrific ethnic cleansing in Gaza. What will it take for a state actor to enter with force of arms to stop this?
Well, what you just described is ultimately required. But one of the key assumptions underpinning Israeli operations from the very beginning was that, first of all, from the Israeli standpoint, anything you do against the Arabs is justified because, after all, they are animals, exactly as Prime Minister Netanyahu described them. That's the first underlying assumption. Anything you do is justified. Therefore, it's not a war crime. You are doing something in service of the Israeli people and the Israeli cause. Secondly, the assumption was that the Arab states are too weak. They're essentially burdened with enormous domestic problems. Egypt has 100 million people living on an infrastructure for perhaps 40 million. They have to be fed, they have to eat, they have to live, there has to be some measure of order. They can't risk a war. Jordan is not as populous, but it too has internal contradictions, doesn't want to risk a war. Therefore, pretty much whatever you want to do, you can do, because the rest of the peninsular Arabs who are very wealthy and living well, they're not going to put anything at risk to help their brother Muslim and Christian Arabs up in a place like Gaza or on the West Bank. And then finally, you have the buildup of Israeli forces on the border with southern Lebanon right now. And I suspect that if they grant some sort of temporary ceasefire, because it will be temporary if they get it in Gaza, they will try to exploit that temporary ceasefire to launch a war on another front, this time against Hezbollah. And they've already started by bombing in northern Lebanon. That will widen the war. That will create opportunities for others who are now standing quietly on the side and doing nothing to begin to seriously contemplate intervention. However, the Israelis believe they have this unassailable trump card. They have control of the government in Washington, and therefore, by definition, control of the United States Armed Forces, particularly air and naval power, that they can employ at will to do whatever they like. And I know that they're betting very heavily, if they go into a place like southern Lebanon to fight Hezbollah, that they expect strike packages provided by air and naval forces in the United States to support them.
Who do you think will blink first in southern Lebanon? Hezbollah, but by blink first, I mean give in first. Hezbollah or the Israelis? I mean, the last time this happened, the Israelis cried uncle and put up a white flag and went home.
Right. The difference between what happened the last time and what could happen this time is that the Israeli population truly believes that there is no alternative to the annihilation of the Arabs on their soil, and anyone on their periphery that they insist represents a threat to Jews. Therefore, they're embarked upon this campaign to rid Israel and its surroundings from any threats. So I think the Israelis will press ahead. The population will support it. And again, they're betting heavily that we will show up and reinforce them. The question then is what happens after that. The peninsular Arabs are obviously not going to do a great deal, but they can finance others who will. The real question in the region is Turkey. What will the Turks do? The Turks have been in Egypt. They held private discussions with the Egyptians. General Sisi was very happy with the outcome of those talks. I rather suspect that Egypt, which is viewed as a former Ottoman possession, will not be abandoned by the Turks. Then the question is, what do the Turks do once the Israelis press into southern Lebanon? That will depend upon Iran. I'm not sure the Iranians are prepared to sit and watch the southern portion of Lebanon utterly pulverized and Hezbollah destroyed. So then the question is, does this become wider? Do we end up at war with Iran and not simply in a supporting role for Israel? That obviously would be manna from heaven, to put it bluntly, for the Israelis, or so they think. All of these things then open up other possibilities. The Russians aren't going to allow us to destroy Iran. The Russians would not stand by and allow such a thing to happen to the Turks. I mean, they may not be close friends and allies, but they are on good terms. I'm certain the Russians would intervene to support the Turks to the extent that they can, as well as the Iranians. And then, of course, China is in the background, lives in fear that it will be denied access to the oil and gas that it desperately needs from the Persian Gulf, and the food that comes to it from West Africa, or East Africa, rather. So it's too soon to say. It's going to take another month or two. I would say, again, mid-April to late May for things to coalesce. But we stand an excellent chance of seeing a real regional war break out that will ultimately be directed against us as well as Israel.
Are there American special forces on the ground? I think I know the answer to this, because there's a picture of Joe Biden shaking hands with them, and then the White House took the picture down of American special forces in American uniforms intermingled with Israeli IDF somewhere in Israel.
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. I know that some have been wounded and probably some killed that went into the Gaza Strip. I don't know the details, but clearly we are very involved there to help and assist. And this is the problem that Americans don't come to terms with, because, quite frankly, Americans aren't focused on any of it. The United States population is focused on the southern border, the 9-10 million illegals that are poured into our country, the deterioration in the rule of law, the failure to deal with the criminality, the disintegration, frankly, of the United States at home. Those are the things that Americans are focused on. They're not really interested in the Middle East. They certainly were never interested in Eastern Europe. But what I see happening is a gradual disengagement from the Ukrainian catastrophe, and we will treat that pretty much as the way we treated Vietnam. Well, that's over. Stop talking about it. The media will comply, and people will then focus elsewhere, and I suspect that will be largely in the Middle East. The question is how large the conflagration in the Middle East becomes before we finally intervene ourselves in some way and say stop. We're a long way from that. Right now, everyone is pleased as punch to sit back in Washington and watch Gaza annihilated.
I'm going to prevail upon your aptitude for domestic American politics. Were you surprised that 100,000 Democrats in Michigan voted none of the above the other day when the alternative was the sitting president of the United States? And do you think Joe Biden would take us to war in the Middle East with some scatterbrained idea that a wartime president has a better chance of getting reelected?
You know, I don't think Joe Biden is going to take us anywhere. If he did, he'd need more than a GPS. I don't think he's a driving force of any kind. The people that are making decisions are really behind the scenes. They're the ones shaping policy. They have lots of facades. You know, Blinken is a good facade. Newland is a facade. All of these people are front men, if you will, for the people behind the scenes making the decisions who have all the money. Look what's happening in Congress. Do you see anybody expressing any concern about the humanitarian catastrophe we've caused in Ukraine, or the humanitarian catastrophe that's rapidly developing in Israel that could not happen without us? I don't see it. So I'm not surprised. I just don't know what it means. I mean, everybody I talk to, says, well, we'll get to the election, then there'll be change. I think increasingly people are looking at it and they're saying, change? Where does the change come from? Who's going to change anything? Somebody was lecturing me the other day because I have great affection for President Trump, and he pointed out to me, well, Doug, I understand that, but keep in mind that when Trump was running for office in 2016, everywhere he went, he listened to crowds of thousands, tens of thousands chant, build the wall, build the wall. Ultimately, what did he do? As soon as he was elected, he decided that he needed to address Obamacare.
Yeah.
So there's a lack of confidence that anybody will stand up and do anything that is really fundamentally in the interest of the American people.
Colonel Macgregor, thank you very much, my dear friend. Thank you for your time, and thanks for your analysis. As always, I know you're busy and much in demand, and we greatly appreciate it and hope you can come back next week.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you don't miss any important news. Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you don't miss any important news.
I think the kindest thing that can be said at this point is that the defensive phase, in a strategic sense, of Russian operations is coming to a close. Tragically, the Ukrainians have done virtually exactly what the Russians would have written for them, and hurled themselves against impregnable defenses that they cannot possibly win against. They've never come to terms, and I don't think for that matter anyone in the West has come to terms with the importance of the links between intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, particularly persistent reconnaissance and firepower. And the Russians understand this probably better than anyone. They've used it very effectively to the point where I know President Putin recently said that he thought that the Ukrainians had lost 13,000 killed. My sources say at least 15,000 with as many wounded. So I think when the epitaph for the Ukrainian army is written, it will be written on the basis of this final phase from Bakhmut to counteroffensive.
So is it fair to say that the three defensive rings, which you characterized for us before today, that even the first one, the one closest to the Ukrainian troops, has not been breached by the Ukrainian troops, even reached, much less reached by them?
You're right, Judge. They never reached the main defensive belt. They moved into the security zone on a couple of occasions, which, of course, is the area chosen by the Russians to annihilate the force in detail before it reaches the defense. So this is over. The question is, what is next?
You mentioned the Russian advantage in reconnaissance. Do not the Ukrainians have American reconnaissance to rely on?
I think they do. In fact, I know they do, but I don't think they have the level of precision fire connected in an automatic sense to overhead surveillance. In other words, the ability to see something that you want to strike and within the space of a minute or two, annihilating that target. That kind of rapidity of response is something that's lacking on the Ukrainian side. I think it's lacking on the NATO side.
Here's what the Department of Defense, they have a new spokesperson, Dr. Deborah Singh, I think her first name's Deborah, I might be wrong, made a statement yesterday, which is the usual cheery optimism, but anxious to hear your comments on it.
I think our assessments have been pretty clear from the beginning. I think, we know, as you continue to see the fight, that it continued to move to the east. It's become more of a grinding battle every day. You saw that in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians can speak to their operations and more to the day-to-day on what's happening on the ground, but we know this is going to be a hard fight. We know this is going to take time, and we are confident that the Ukrainians have what they need. They have the combat power. They have the ability to be successful in their counteroffensive operations. We see them launching both defensive and offensive operations right now, but I would let them speak to more of that.
Okay, it's Dr. Sabrina Singh. My apologies for getting her first name wrong, but does she know what she's talking about?
Judge, we increasingly utilize women as spokespersons. And the reason for that is that the journalists and tough-minded individuals that may still reside in the media are unwilling to ask women hard questions. They don't want to embarrass the women. They don't want to come across as impolite. God forbid that they should be termed toxic masculine types. So that's part of the problem. Second thing is, this woman has a pedigree that goes all the way back to Hillary Clinton. She's been a Democratic operative for many years, which means that she can lie without compunction. And she did so very effectively here. This is not surprising in the least, and it's become standard fare inside the Beltway. Does she really understand anything? I have no idea. But lying without compunction is a precondition for rising in the current Washington environment.
I mean, it's almost criminal, the substantial and material deceptions that she offered. And in my opinion, is there such a thing as journalistic malpractice? Who knows? For the media to just pick it up uncritically and not to challenge her, whether it's because she's a woman or for whatever reason.
Well, the media is part of it. I mean, let's be frank. The media is dominated by people who are 100% behind this war to destroy Russia. The whole war began as a lie. It continues as a lie. It will end tragically for the people that are the most vulnerable, that is the Ukrainians. It will end badly, I think, for any Europeans that continue to support it. Hopefully, we will not be dragged in. But the bottom line is, it's one lie after the next. The Russians will ultimately establish the truth, and that will be hard to conceal when it's finally revealed.
Well, here's your former colleague, I think you know him, retired General Ben Hodges, on what he thinks should happen next.
Ukraine needs long-range precision weapons, and I'm very frustrated that our administration has so far refused to provide the ATACMS and other long-range precision weapons, which would help Ukraine hit Russian targets in Crimea. Because at the end of the day, Crimea is the decisive terrain. As long as Russia occupies Crimea, Ukraine will never be safe, and Ukraine will never be able to rebuild its economy. So Crimea is the decisive terrain. And if the U.S. would provide these long-range weapons to Ukraine, then the Russians would have to begin to leave Crimea.
Well, first of all, Judge, I do not know Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. I think he said he was class of 80 at West Point. And like Petraeus and many others, he has joined in to a substantial extent to push lies about this entire conflict. And I think in professional terms, the kindest thing I can say about him, and Petraeus for that matter, is that these people are professional pygmies. They don't seem to understand the gravity of their...
What was the word you used, Colonel? Pygmies?
Pygmies, yes. In general terms, these people are not serious professional soldiers. To make those kinds of suggestions is to invite a much wider and more destructive war.
Yes.
He also doesn't bother to point out, and of course we never do in the West, that thus far, President Putin has actually held back the Russian military. The Russian military can do an infinitely more serious amount of damage than it has to thus far. Putin has never wanted to kill large numbers of Ukrainians. He has been very mindful from the very beginning that at some point in the future, he's going to want to live with the people that he's been fighting, and he does not want to inflict unnecessary damage. We've left him no choice, and as we've done in the past, we've said, you know, you can do one of two things. You Russians can either leave Ukraine or commit suicide. Those are the only options, and if you don't choose those, then we will fight you until there are none of you left. Under those circumstances, he's had to persevere, and he's done so very effectively. But the Russian military has never really unleashed its full power.
You sent me a piece in one of our many email exchanges, for which, of course, I am deeply and personally and professionally grateful. It wasn't written by you, but it startled me. And it basically said the war will end when a Ukrainian military commander on the battlefield surrenders to a Russian military commander on the battlefield, because the Ukrainian military and political leadership will either be dead or will have left Ukraine. Do you subscribe to that doomsday scenario, Colonel?
Well, if we insist on stonewalling the Russians, if we continue to live in fantasy world and drag the Ukrainians down this path with us, we'll all end up in hell together. And I think that's what the message is. The Russians will now move forward. Now, will they do it next week or July, or will it come at the beginning of August? I have no idea, but they're in a position now to launch a punishing offensive. There have already been some offensive moves up near Lyman and towards Zaporizhzhia. I would expect the Russian military to sweep across the rest of eastern Ukraine and then cross and seize Odessa. So I think those things will happen. The question is, what are we going to do in the meantime? Are we going to talk to the Russians? Are we going to establish some sort of arrangement based on reality, based on the facts? Are we finally going to recognize their legitimate security interests? I mean, I thought it was interesting that Hodges said, well, as long as the Russians are in Ukraine, or excuse me, in Crimea, Ukraine will never be safe. Well, as far as the Russians are concerned, as long as you have this NATO-backed government or Washington puppet in Kiev with a large army at its disposal in Ukraine, they will never be safe. So the question is, how do we satisfy everyone's security needs? And the answer has always been the same: neutrality. The question is, what's going to be left of Ukraine? The longer we wait, the more likely it is that Russian troops will stand on the Polish border. Those are facts.
Right. We'll take a break. When we come back, another outburst from Yevgeny Prigozhin, a very, very strong, typical Prigozhin outburst for Colonel Macgregor to analyze right after this. So, Colonel, welcome back. Mr. Prigozhin issued another one of his outbursts. This is about a 30-minute, we're not going to play the whole thing. This is about a 30-minute, appears to be extemporaneous statement he made on his own Telegram channel. The first one references that we've excerpted from it, Leopards, tanks. And since you're a former tank commander, we'll play that first. And then the second one is more big picture. But first, his reference to 60 Leopards destroyed and the monstrous lies surrounding the report of their destruction.
What we are being told is a profound deception. And we will face the fact only when, as was the case on Krasny Liman, as was the case in Kherson, as was the case in many other places, A bunch of these scum, realizing that they have already lost a huge piece of territory, gather and declare that they have regrouped the more advantageous positions. The same thing is happening in Bakhmut. The enemy is getting deeper, deeper and deeper into our defenses. The enemy saves his soldiers. The enemy saves his equipment. All that the enemy doesn't save is ammunition, and that's why our soldiers die and leave with injuries. Time is rapidly collapsing.
All right, that's not the one which he mentions the leopards, but it makes it sound like he thinks the Ukrainians are winning. Even if he believes that, why say it in public? What does he gain by that? Is he running for president of Russia?
Well, I don't think that he believes the Ukrainians are winning. I don't think that's his point. I think he's expressing frustration with the Russian high command that they have not already launched decisive offensive operations. And why? His attitude is, if you allow the Ukrainians to survive this phase in any form, if you allow them to withdraw, history teaches that they will try to regroup, that they may receive new weapons from the West, and we've got to fight it all over again. So I think his view is, let's get this over with. Let's attack decisively, crush what's left, and that will do more to save Russian lives than anything else.
Do they fear a long-standing guerrilla war, and thus they want to destroy as many soldiers as they can?
Well, I think that's in the back of his mind, and I think others in Moscow are considering that. Again, this goes back to the question of what do you have left when this is over?
Right.
And if you want to negotiate an end to the war, you've got to have strict neutrality. Otherwise, you see something in the sort of vein of Kosovo resurfacing in Ukraine, where you're going to have the enemy come back again and again and again. I think he's worried about that. And, you know, he has his reasons to feel that way because he also knows Ukrainians are very tenacious fighters. Let there be no doubt about it. The Ukrainians are good soldiers. The ones we're facing now, or he's facing at this point, are probably the least well-trained that he's seen since this war began.
If you're leading an offensive against a well-entrenched adversary, do you lead with your best troops or your newest troops?
Well, if you have to do what they've done, and I don't think they had to, but unfortunately made a decision to do it under great pressure, you really do have to use your best troops, the people that are most accustomed to operating under fire. Having soldiers that have been under fire before is helpful because they know what can and can't happen. They have a more sober-minded view of the operation. The problem with this entire thing from day one is that even if you brought in the United States Army in great numbers and you said breach this defense, it would take substantial Air Force as well as Army capabilities to work on it for months. It would not come quickly. So the Ukrainians never had a snowball's chance in hell, frankly, of breaking through these defenses, not in any span of time that we demanded.
You mentioned the advantage of experienced soldiers, and of course you yourself have much experience under fire. Is it instinctual? Is it like muscle memory that you just instinctually know what to do at the right moment on the basis of having been there before?
All discipline is a form of habit. Much depends on how rigorously and frequently you have trained. And you have to train on a scale that we rarely do in peacetime, so that you reach a point where it comes naturally to do what is right and what makes sense. Now, you just said, for a soldier like me, well, I'm out of date. You have to have people that have been fighting in this war, that have developed an appreciation for Russian capabilities, for the missiles, for the rockets, for the artillery, for the tanks and armored fighting vehicles, mines, and so forth. Understand Russian tactics, understand where they set up and why. For instance, today it was reported that HIMARS had supposedly destroyed a Russian rocket artillery battery, Grad missile battery. And we can't find much evidence that they destroyed the battery, but there was a huge explosion, so we assume they did. More that we look at, the more convinced we are that this was to entice the Ukrainians into firing more ammunition so that their batteries could be targeted. My point is, The Russians are competent. They were never stupid. And you have to understand that. And I think there may not be as many people on hand now as there were a year ago to fathom that and appreciate it.
Gary, play the other clip, please, from Mr. Prigozhin.
No one destroyed 60 leopards. This is total nonsense. Shoigu leaves according to the principle that to be believed, the lie must be monstrous. And that's why deceptions happen. Two realities.
No one destroyed 60 leopards. Shoigu, that's the Russian Minister of Defense, operates under the principle, I think I'm fairly summarizing this, that to be believed, the lie must be monstrous. Have 60 leopards been destroyed? First of all, what's a leopard? And secondly, again, why attack Shoigu by name like this?
The Leopard tank is the standard tank weapon of the German army. Now, I don't know what kinds of leopards he's referring to because there are different variations. There's the Leopard 1, the Leopard 2, Leopard 4, and so forth. I didn't know that there were 60 leopards on the battlefield. I knew that there were at least 16 to 25, maybe more have shown up. What we can say with absolute certainty is that the Ukrainians have lost almost 280 tanks, perhaps 300 or 400 other armored fighting vehicles, as well as the 15,000 dead. That's absolutely certain. Secondly, on Shoigu.
Excuse me for interrupting. Just in the offensive.
Yes, just in this offensive. I don't know how many of them are Leopard tanks. I don't know. I don't think it makes much difference because the way things are set up right now, you could destroy almost anything on that battlefield because of the links that I explained earlier between persistent surveillance and almost immediate precision fires.
When do you think the neocons in the State Department, Mrs. Newland, and the politicians in the West Wing who somehow think that President Biden can be reelected will recognize they need an off-ramp, or stated differently, will recognize that Ukraine can't win this, cannot win this?
Remember, ideologues, or let's go back to the beginning. Ideology is a secular variant of religion. These are true believers in the ideology, and the ideology of militant liberal democracy, wokeism, combine it with globalism, internationalism, all bound up as one, is something they fervently believe, and they're certain that it will bring them victory. I don't think you're going to convince them of much of anything unless you were to suit them up and put them on the battlefield, which I think has very little chance of ever occurring. So I think they're going to fight it to the last Ukrainian. So I don't see much evidence there. The only thing I did want to say, though, is about Shoigu. Shoigu is not a professional soldier. He was appointed as Minister of Defense for a whole range of reasons. He has a long record of competence in action. He's someone that President Putin trusts. And I think Shoigu is somebody who is cautious. And if Prigozhin is upset about anything, it's the extent to which the Russian military has been so deliberate and cautious. Okay, I'm sympathetic to him because if I were sitting where he is with the kinds of forces that I know the Russians have, then I would say, let's not waste any more time. Let's pull the trigger and get this over with. So I'm sympathetic to his views. But, Shoigu has done a good job. He's performed well. Gerasimov is highly competent. Everything's gone down well. If you look at the balance of casualties, Russian casualties are very, very light. They've been very successful. And President Putin's intent of not killing large numbers of Ukrainians, if it can be avoided, has actually been adhered to. So I understand how he feels, but I think it's a bigger picture than he realizes.
Colonel Macgregor, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you very much for sharing your time and your thoughts with us.
Thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you don't miss any important news. Thank you for sticking with us all the way to...
Bima, apain HP-nya ini, Bima? Ini kenapa bisa loading terus dia m-bankingnya? Kok nggak tahu Mima apain tadi malam ini? Nanti Mima apa nggak upgrade iOS ga?
दोस्तों इस वीडियो में मैं आपको वीडियो किस तरह से वीडियो जूम करते हैं और जूम आउट करते हैं। दोस्तों आपने कई जगह देखा होगा जिसमें आपने वीडियो को जूम इन और जूम आउट करके देखा होगा किसी की वीडियो में, तो वो बहुत ही आसान तरीका है। अगर आप इस वीडियो को पूरा देखेंगे तो आपको बहुत ही अच्छे तरीके से समझ आ जाएगी और आप बहुत ही अच्छे तरीके से किसी भी वीडियो को जूम आउट या जूम इन करना सीख जाओगे। इसके लिए आपको वीडियो पूरी देखनी पड़ेगी, तभी आपको समझ आएगी। और अगर वीडियो आपको अच्छी लगे तो आपने वीडियो को लाइक कर देना है और कमेंट में बताना है कि और इस टॉपिक से रिलेटेड आपको कौन सी वीडियो चाहिए। तो मैं आपको पूरी कोशिश करूँगा समझाने की वीडियो को किस तरह से जूम इन या जूम आउट किया जाता है। तो आपने इस चैनल पर आपने इस वीडियो पर बने रहना है ताकि आपको वीडियो की पूरी समझ आ सके। चलते हैं वीडियो की तरफ। मैं आपको वीडियो जूम इन और जूम आउट करना सिखाऊंगा, तो आप अपने अच्छे तरीके से बने रहना है। और काइन मास्टर में आपको इतने अच्छे तरीके से समझाऊंगा कि आपको कोई भी नहीं सिखा पाए। दोस्तों, इसके लिए आपको मीडिया में जाना है, अपने फाइल सेलेक्ट करनी है जो आपको जिसमें आपको वो करना है, ये इस पर सेलेक्ट करना है। उसके बाद दोस्तों, जो वीडियो आपको जूम इन या जूम आउट चाहिए करनी है वो वीडियो करनी है। जैसे कि दोस्तों मैं ये वीडियो करना चाहता हूँ, ये दोस्तों वीडियो मैंने ले ली। अब दोस्तों इस वीडियो को मैं जूम करना चाहता हूँ, तो मैं किस तरह से करूँगा। सबसे पहले आपको क्या करना है, इसी वीडियो को सिलेक्ट करना है। सिलेक्ट कर लिया, उसके बाद दोस्तों क्या करना है, उसके बाद आपको दोस्तों इस तरह से करना है। बीच